Alistair Jones and I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Just a couple of housekeeping matters. First of all, just your cell phones turned off would be great. And you obviously can see the exit signs to your left or your right, and apparently the staff know what to do if there's an emergency. Is that right? Apparently. So I think that's the housekeeping, but it's my real pleasure to welcome you here all this evening. And inaugural professorial lectures are a very important part of the life of a university. They're a way in which we communicate the leading research that we're doing to the wider community. It also gives us a chance for the wider staff to connect with the public and the wider community, and to effectively, I think, communicate the research we're doing to a wider world, but also to our colleagues. Often, as university staff, with 2,000 staff, we forget and don't know what other members of our staff are doing. So it's a great opportunity for staff, the community, to come together and to enhance the university's ongoing commitment really to continue education ways we connect to the community. So it's now my real pleasure to ask Robin Longhurst, Pro Vice-Chancellor Education, also standing in for the Dean of Arts and Social Sciences, to introduce Iain to you.
Professor Iain White specialises in the field of environmental planning. His work takes an interdisciplinary perspective that aims to better understand the nature of environmental problems and how they can be addressed. Iain has been awarded research funds totalling over 2.5 million from a variety of sources, including the European Union, various government departments and national research bodies, the private sector, and the Asia-Pacific Network. His most recent project has involved researching the possibility of making houses resilient to flooding, from the materials used, to the institutional barriers, to the views of residents. The project involved 7 different countries and resulted in new national guidance written in partnership with government, industry, and citizens. Prior to joining the University of Waikato as Professor of Environmental Planning in 2013, Iain was the Director of the Centre for Urban and Regional Ecology at the University of Manchester in the UK. He holds a degree in Geography, a Master's degree in Town and Country Planning, and a PhD in Environmental Planning. Finally, there are just a couple of other things that I can tell you about Iain, and that is that I'm very fortunate to have him as a colleague. He has a wonderful sense of humour, which you're likely to discover this evening. He's also father to a rather special old dog called Toby, and he likes the occasional pint. That's Iain, not Toby. And I hear from my other colleagues that it's good to have Iain and his partner Lisa on your team at pub quizzes. So I'm especially pleased to be able to introduce Iain tonight. And without further ado, what he's going to talk about in his inaugural professorial lecture is insights into the difficulties in managing the risk of flooding and the new approaches to keeping water out of buildings. So please join with me in welcoming to the floor Professor Iain White.
Ina mana, ina reo, ina parangamaha I hui nei tina koutou katoa. Thank you for coming, everybody. And it's so nice just to see people here I know as well, my friends, my colleagues, neighbours, and students as well. And thank you, Alistair and Robin, for introducing me. I found this actually quite a difficult lecture to write because it's a pretty challenging audience. You are, even though you don't necessarily know that you are. You're, you know, there's members of the public, there's colleagues whose work I greatly respect, and getting that pitch right so everyone goes home, even though they've not wasted the time by bypassing watching the block or whatever, then it's quite a difficult pitch. So, and then if it's not just challenging enough, they make you dress like a wizard, which is, I am quite getting used to. So I decided to do a self-contained lecture, which is essentially about flooding. It's the title on the screen, and it's going to give you a little bit of history about what I've been doing for the last 15, 20 years. But there's also a few deeper, more abstract messages. It's a little bit about science and how science influences science, policy and practice, and how certain we are about things. So the more we know, the more we don't know. It's a bit of a play about what we expect science to provide for society. We expect it to provide more data, more evidence, more certainty, but it's not necessarily the case. Sometimes the more you find out about things, the more you realize you don't know things which you thought, you know, were pretty obvious. So it's a little bit about how sometimes the deeper we explore, the more our inadequacies are exposed. But first off, before we get to that, I know it's come tradition at these kind of events to talk a little bit about your journey, how you got there, and old photos and so on. And this is a bit I've been absolutely cringing about. I tried to get out of it, but my colleagues wouldn't let me. They demanded to see at least one slide of old photos. So this is going to be it. We'll get it over with. We'll both be happier for it. And then 2 minutes in, we can start with the real stuff. So, by the way, this is the only time you're allowed to say, "Oh, doesn't he look cute?" at one of my lectures. Okay? It doesn't have to be interactive. You don't have to say it. So that's me when I started my academic career. This is the start of primary school. Where did it all go wrong, some might say. And then those two, me starting university for the first time with my nana there, and that's me graduating with my PhD. And my PhD was on how we manage water. It was held here at the University of Manchester. I think it's Photoshop because it's not raining in this picture. Somehow the magic of techies managed to work that out. And those two chaps at the bottom were my two early mentors. So the guy in the middle is Professor Joe Howe, who's my supervisor, and the guy on the left is Professor John Hanley. And it was him who really got me interested in the topic about how we manage water. We'd had major floods about the time, and it seemed obvious to me that it wasn't just a matter of holding water back, but we could think more generally about where we build and how. And that meant that maybe we could have a more planning, more geography perspective about how we use space and how we use space over time to maybe think about how we do things differently. And I remember going into John Hanley's room and giving him my idea for a PhD. And he was pretty intimidating, not because of who he was. He's a really nice guy, but he'd just been awarded an OBE. He was quite an important chap. And he put me at ease. He'd made me a cup of tea. And then he fixed me with this look and said, "Okay, you've got 2 minutes. Tell me why this is a PhD." And so I took a quick sip of tea and put it down, and then I was just about to speak, and he stopped. He said to just wait there and just went, "Come in," and shouted at the door, "Come in." There was no one there. And then he shouted again at the door, "Come in." And I knew there was no one at the door. And I realized it's the sound of my cup hitting the table. It assumed that someone was at the door. So I had this dilemma. Do I tell him? Do I not tell him? Do I do it? Anyway, to cut a long story short, that's when I decided that this is the kind of eccentric work environment I could feel myself excelling in. So I was at Manchester for around 15 years or so, until I arrived here around 18 months ago. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for everyone for making Lisa and I feel really welcome. Okay, it's over with. Now we can get on to the main part of the talk. So these are the wider points, because it's not just about flooding. Flooding is almost a case study of how we understand science and how it influences the wider things. So first of all, one of the themes we need to bear in mind as we progress through is just how concepts gain power, and how they gain resources, and how they command resources over time. Because the way that we frame and understand concepts has real long-term power, not just over the years, but over decades as well. So that's one of the first things to bear in mind. The second is about certainty. How certain are we as scientists that we know things? And how is this communicated? And how might that become changed, through the more lens it goes through? There's a quote there that I like to use when discussing about certainty, and it's by Mark Twain. That's not me at the bottom, that's Mark Twain. And I did a paper which is called "The More We Know, the More We Don't Know, Reflections on a Decade of Flood Risk Management." And this is essentially forming the basis of the talk today. So I found this great quote that I thought would be perfect to start the paper with, because it essentially says that it's not what you know, it's how certain you are about things. And so I thought I'd use this paper. Being a typical academic, I had to find out the exact source, and I just couldn't find it anywhere. I even ended up going down to the British Library one weekend, reading the complete works of Mark Twain. This is what academics do. And it took longer to find this than write the paper. And it was used by everybody. I kept seeing it over the internet, just attributed to Mark Twain. And everyone was using it as the pitfalls of assigning too much weight to information. And people need to be a bit more careful. And so, long story short, he never actually said it, but no one had checked. So I can confirm that he never said that, even though everybody still used it. But I still used it because I thought it was an amusing example of how people need to be a bit more careful. So we've got concepts, we've got certainty. The next one's about how does this lead to how we do things differently? Because the concepts frame things, and then the data gives us a bit of weight of information. That then leads to, okay, what's our managerial approach? And we've never known as much about flooding as we do right now. There's lots of expertise around, and yet it seems to be a problem that's gaining worse, becoming more severe every year. We're getting more and more examples, and that should lead us, whatever cause to think about. It's not just what we do, but it's how we do it as well. And this is partly about how science and society interact, how the things that we do can influence the policymakers and also practitioners as well. It's also about who's involved in making the science, whose knowledge counts. Because some of the problems that we have can't be solved by any one discipline. Disciplines are really good at narrow and deep focus, but when you get towards some of the broad problems we have in society, they demand different kind of approaches. So it's also about the science policy interface, or how science as a community, as a university, influences the wider society. Well, first of all, talking about risk, just to give you a little bit of overview about the different ways that people might perceive it. I think the way that it's been used, particularly over the last century or so, is that it's been described as a calculative rationality. And what that means is we calculate a value in quite a rational way. And some of the ways that that's done is the thing on the screen, risk equals probability times consequence. So we determine the risk by working out what the probability of the event is and what the consequences of that might be. And that gives us some kind of notional value. And that's good to a certain extent, but there's different ways of perceiving risk, because it is a concept that different disciplines see things in different ways. Alternatively, Beck has done quite a lot of work on how risk is socially constructed, and that it's actually incalculable. The way that we decide risk just cannot be calculated, just because it depends who's doing the calculation. Different disciplines, different backgrounds, different ways of knowing might come up with different figures. And if you accept that there's no one value, then maybe Beck's right, and that it's actually incalculable. Wynne goes further and actually says that the approach is quite misleading, because it's more than a method. It's a misbegotten culture which inadvertently actively conceals that ignorance. And what that means is that it has real power, it has authority, it has weight. Just by a line, a map, or a figure or percentage, it has a bit of gravitas, and we need to be aware of that. The quote I generally use to describe this is this on screen. And Donald Rumsfeld, former US Secretary of Defense, did this quote, which is, it's a fantastic quote. It does make sense if you bear with it. So I'll give you a minute. As we know, there are known knowns. There are some things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there's some things we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know. This actually won an award for being the least opaque utterance of 2002 by the Plain English campaign. But I think it actually has some academic merit, whether he meant it or not. It's essentially arguing about knowledge and how knowledge is incomplete. And we can only measure what we can see and what we have facts about. But there's a lot out there that we can't actively factor in. So calculative rationality is pretty good at known knowns. It can even deal with some of the known unknowns. But the unknowns, then those are by the wayside. And then how might that approach, the calculative rationality, lead to impacts, what we do in practice? Well, this is the River Thames by London, and you can pretty much see by this one picture, not necessarily what the approach is, but who's involved, what disciplines, what knowledge is needed for that to happen, how a decision's made. So number one was about 200 years ago when the first wall was built to hold back the water. They decided it wasn't quite high enough. They put some more bricks on top of that, and then a few more bricks on top of that a few years later, until you can start to see the trend. Is that this is not just an approach, but it's also backed up by an entire bodies of learning. And it's been incredibly effective at managing water, particularly when we can measure it and we know where the risk is. So it's based on ways of knowing about probability statistics and so on, and engineering domains, and it's been really successful by rivers and the coast in particular. And it's also supported by bespoke expertise, expert knowledge, huge financial advantages. And so we're starting to think that given all our knowledge, and we have worked pretty hard over this over the last 150 years or so, we should really be managing this a lot better. And yet we seem to get more and more events. And this is partly because the methodology is it's a static measuring methodology. And by that I mean they measure something that is perceived to be static and fixed. I'll go into it a little bit more later, but some of the risks are dynamic, they're changing. Now this is, it looks a little bit more complicated than it is, but I'll talk you through it and it'll make sense in the end. Is that on the left, we have flood events in the UK. We had two major ones, one in 1953, one in 1947, and then we didn't have any for about 50 years. And then when I was doing my master's dissertation, 1998, we had another one, and that's what I did my dissertation on. It's one of the reasons why I got interested in the topic. It seems so obvious that the way we build and where we build could have a real influence on overall risk. And then we had another major one in 2000. And then for the very first time, a measure of how many homes were at risk from flooding. And this is what the table's about, is that there was 23 million homes in England in 2011, and they did annual reviews in 2001, 2004, and 2009, just how many homes were at risk. And they did it looking at different sources. So they had rivers in the sea, so that's like the Waikato flooding or flooding at Thames. And then surface water flooding. That's when you get a very intense rainfall event and the drains can't cope. And then groundwater flooding, which is a long, slow rainfall period where the groundwater just keeps on rising until we can't cope. So there's different sources of risk which might demand different managerial intervention. 2000 was when I started my PhD, which was on flooding, so it just happened to be at the right time. And then after 2000, they decided to look how many houses were at risk. And this is the figure, very precise, 1,724,225. I mean, when we look at it now, it's incredibly precise. It's not even one house out. They were pretty certain about this. They knew to the house what was at risk and what wasn't. And then we had two more major floods, 2002 and 2004. And that gives us a chance to think about whether we were right or not. And so the data was calculated again. And the first figure ended up going up slightly, but you'll notice that it gets a little bit more vaguer. And that's what I mean by the more we know, the more we don't know, is that we think, okay, we're a bit less certain. We know there's a dynamic system out there, climate change, urbanization. But the one to watch is this 80,000 figure. That was essentially homes who've reported to their local water company that they had drainage issues. And then there was 1.7 million extra homes from groundwater flooding, which is the first time that had been calculated. The other thing to bear in mind is that within 3 years, which is not a long period of time in the scheme of things, is that we weren't out by 1%, 2%, or some kind of regime we were comfortable with. We were out by an enormous amount. It was twice as much within the space of 3 years. And that should give us a bit of a pause of a thought about our methodology for determining risk and our managerial approach. And then it got a bit worse. Another series of flood events, in particular 2007, flooded whole areas that weren't at risk from flooding. And that's the thing to bear in mind, is that how could that happen unless the way that we determine risk might need some attention? And so we looked again at the figures. And this is where things really changed. So if you think about, the important line here is not the first line, the 2.4 million. That's gone up a little bit, but you're going from 80,000 to 3.8 million. And then think about the previous slide about the wall. All the focus for the last 100 of years just can't tackle this risk. You can't build walls in urban areas. It's about how you plan, where you build, how you make space for water. It demands different professions involved. And so, again, the overall figure, we're out by double again. So, must do better. But it's pretty rare that you get these events to ground truth what you think is correct. And so they're pretty valuable in scientific terms to check what we think we know. And we had some more events, some of which were flooding areas which hadn't flooded before again. And this is becoming a bit of much of an annual event in the UK. So what we can take from this is that we can say with pretty certain authority that 6.8 million is probably wrong, which isn't what you want scientists to normally say, but it might mean that we need to do things differently. We need to think about maybe not putting too many lines on a map and think about being more precautionary. So what are the key issues about that? We'll go back to our three themes from the start. Our concept was interpreted and framed in a certain way. It had a real technical emphasis on defense, which only works when you really solve your information and where the risk is. There's also what's called the principle of stationarity, which is, it sounds a bit more complicated than it is. It basically means we assume things remain stationary. So a 1 in 100-year event in 1880 would be the same as a 1 in 100-year event in 1980. We assume the climate is static. And over a longer time period, you can sort of use that to measure what is how bad was this event compared to the past. But we know that climate change is changing weather patterns. We know that urbanization is changing how water interacts with catchments. So we know it's a very dynamic system. So it's a static methodology with a dynamic system, which means that it can't be right. We know it can't be 1 in 100. It just can't, because we don't know what it is or what it's going to be. The best way to explain that is the figures that we use from Prague. Prague had a major flood event in 1997. It was a 1 in 1,000-year event. It was enormous. And then they had another major flood event in 2002. Now, some of the questions was, how can you have two major flood events in such quick proximity and there still be 1 in 1,000 and 1 in a few hundred? And one of the people answered, well, technically it is a new millennium. Our data is still robust. You haven't caught us out just yet. But it also means that we might need to think about just how, if we're not that certain of data, then maybe we need to think more precaution about where we build, how we build, and so on. The other things about certainty, and this flies against what we might expect science to provide. We expect it to provide more certainty, more evidence about, the more we know, the more we find out. Not the more we know, the more we don't know. And so there's been this shift from precise to fuzzy data, which goes against your instincts about how you expect it to provide. And it also means that if you think about our managerial approach, how certain are we about our lines on maps, our percentage figures of risk? We can make pretty good guesses, and as scientists, we're pretty good at communicating uncertainty, but how does that get lost through the chain from policy to practice? And then finally, we only realized it was wrong because it was ground truth. We probably wouldn't have looked at the 2001 again too often. And it also meant that we had a huge national debate and a huge change of approach. And it meant that flooding became the domain of multiple disciplines within a decade when it wasn't. Historically, it just didn't have that remit. And it meant that different knowledges counted, and different ways of viewing risk started to count, and we started to think about the wider picture. And so one of the things to bear in mind for New Zealand is that what would be the case if this happened here? How certain are we of the date we have right now? And this led to a huge call to do things differently. We had lots of the press having a go at planners, having a go at scientists, having a go at everybody. And that led to a real difference in how we do things. Is that the policy changed within a matter of a few months, is that we started to get new policies emerging, that we needed to learn to live with rivers. And this was a new message, because it realized that you couldn't defend against all risks. We need to live with a risk, make space for water. And this wasn't just in the UK, this was everywhere in Europe. This is the Dutch Room for the River initiative, similar to the German equivalent. And so if you can't actually keep water where you'd like it to be, then you need to make room for it within urban areas. We need to design buildings, communities to be able to accept more water. And so the overall approach was flood defense, just one siloed approach about building hard defenses. Very expensive, and also has what you call an escalator effect. The more you build these walls, the more people feel safe behind them, and it actually fuels more building. It creates this cycle of risk where it becomes almost an escalator, and so then you have to put more and bigger walls. And there was no real avoidance, and that led to a change, which is called the risk shift from flood defense to flood risk management. This is essentially what I've been involved with for the last 10, 15 years or so. And the flood defense was only part of the story. And that spatial planning was also part of the mix. Insurance sector, how do we enable people to recover and cope, rather than just the state taking all responsibility? So citizens were involved too. We had flood risk maps online where people can make choices about where they want to live, how much risk they are happy to accept. And it also brings us to resilience, which is where the next part of the lecture is going to go to. Is if you can't be sure that you can protect against all risks, then you either need to avoid it or be prepared to cope with what happens. And that's where the research proposal I'm going to talk about next, flood resilient buildings, emerged. So this is how we used to be resilient. This is what's called the Isle of Tewkesbury. It's not officially an island, it just got flooded, but you can see where the safe areas are. And it's basically the church got there first around 1,000 years ago. And you know, they got their act together pretty early on from a land use perspective. They got the high safe area, and everyone else started to move around. And then more modern ways of dealing with risk is something like this. These are floating homes. I've been inside these. These are in the Netherlands, and they're fantastic. You know, you get a water view. It's wherever you look out the window, whether you want it or not, you've got a water view. You know, they're pretty expensive, and they're not for everyone. And it's also about avoiding risk, not just trying to design your way out of a solution which costs a little bit more money. It's also about new development. But what about the risk that's already there? Now, 99% of the urban form is already there. We only get, on average, only about 1% changes per annum. And that means we've only got very few ways to transition towards a different kind of city, a different kind of urban form. And this is what we do with our existing building stock. And it's about as low tech as you can get. We just have sandbags. So part of the rationale for the project that I'm going to talk about next is doing things differently. Let's have how this did it. It was called the King Canute of Somerset. He was a builder. His house was getting flooded, so he decided to stop building whoever's house he was going to build in, brings all his diggers back home, and he built his own flood wall, and it worked. It was actually a real success story, but not everyone has those resources or, you know, at their fingertips. So we can actually do things differently. The average home, you can make flood-proof up to about this high until the sideways pressure gets a little bit much. So do you think about the points of entry to the building fabric and how we can tank and houses, and we have different doors, different technology to do things differently. So all the different points of entry does have a different technical solution that we can retrofit to risks that are already there. We can also think about different scales. This is a community scale solution where it's actually a pavement where you can program it to flip up. And so it operates as a pavement, or when it's at times of high water, it holds back water. So part of our rationale was that we could go beyond sandbags. Surely, over the last 100 years, we've learned something where we can do things differently and we can tackle the existing risks better. So this is the rationale for the project, which I'm now going to talk about. It was called SMARTIS, Smart Resilience Technology Systems and Tools. They always have awful names, these projects. It was about 8 million New Zealand dollars, 7 different countries. Those were the different countries. They all had different kinds of risks. So you had the flash flooding in Athens, you had the long, slow riverine flooding in Germany, which all demanded different kind of solutions. You had different warning times. You had different kind of hazards and complications you had to deal with. And this is what it looked like. It was actually quite good fun. We had the German partners had a test tank, so we could build a house in it and then flood it full of water. It had a serious backdrop, but it was really enjoyable to do. It brought out the big kid in you. And so we had these flood-resilient doors, flood-resilient windows, and you was measuring how much water went through per hour. And the idea was to get it onto zero, is that we could, by testing different technologies, we could get something that works. And we could then get that accredited and start using that. So that's one of the things in action. There's different technologies as well. We can have valves which stop water flowing into houses. This was us testing something. The test tank in Germany again, this was an automatic dam, which one of the things that looks like a pavement, but can be programmed automatically when the water reaches a certain point just to flip up and hold it back. And so testing the technology was one of the partners, and we were also looking at, well, if it's so good, why isn't it used? How do stakeholders view it? How do the public view it? Do they actually want these technology? Wouldn't they prefer to be defended behind walls? And so we also looked on a bigger community scale. So this wasn't the fabric of the building. This was a movable temporary barrier that can be moved wherever the risk is. So very cost-effective solution. And as long as you've got enough warning, it works. And as long as you've got somewhere to put it that's flat and makes sense, it works. So it's actually quite attractive for areas where there might not be enough budget to defend against. This is a similar one that we tested. This is a mobile inflatable barrier. And this is going back to some of the things I said at the start about things like flooding aren't problems that any one discipline can solve. They need an interdisciplinary approach to be able to address them. This was used earlier this year in the UK, a temporary flood defence measure when you know that the water is getting high. Certain river systems you have much more warning than others, and then you can put the measures in place. So all these measures are really good in certain circumstances. They're really good for retrofitting. And retrofitting is a silver bullet, really, for hazard management, because we've got no way of influencing that via the planning system. The planning system is really constrained. It can only look at new development. We don't have many mechanisms in society more general to influence what's already there. You've got taxation, you've got incentives, you've got personal behaviour, but really, that's where most of our mistakes have already been made. And if you can focus there, it's pretty cost effective. So it's pretty good for retrofitting to the existing risk, to manage surface water flooding, which can't be solved by building walls next to rivers or the sea, or when we're uncertain, when we just don't know what the risk is, we could be precautionary. It's also pretty much of a social justice angle in that small settlements, rural settlements, never seem to get the money. The flood defence money is done on a cost-benefit ratio of number of houses protected per $1 million spent. And so settlements with only 5 or 10 houses never seem to justify that expenditure. It's also really useful for one-off buildings that we need to protect. This is critical infrastructure that was flooded in the UK, and it was protected by sandbags, which failed. And as a result of that, about 140,000 people were without water for about a week. And so you can be exposed to the risks of flooding, even if you're not flooded yourself, because of the infrastructure. So we can think more cleverly about what we protect, as well as where we do it. The problem is that although we had a lot of potential, people didn't necessarily want them on their building. It was quite good for commercial buildings, but really, people preferred defences. They didn't want their house to be the last line of defence, and you can't blame them for that. So the public were uncertain whether they work, and whether they should pay for it or whether the state should pay for it. Were we essentially commodifying a new sector and risk that really the state should be doing? Decision makers in local authorities, regional councils and so on didn't feel that they knew enough to be able to justify spending public money on this. How would they know it worked? Because it's so new, we didn't have the long-term data about how it works in each scenario. Insurers didn't know how to price it. If you put this on your home, instinctively you think, well, we should get a reduction in premium, but it didn't necessarily work out that way because they didn't know how it would perform. There's a story which I could never find out if it's true or not, is that we put a flood resilient door in a property, someone moved house, someone else new moved in, and they put a cat flap in the middle. And it does damage its structural integrity a little bit. We didn't test that in the test tank about cat flaps. So you're dealing with people, and you need to make it as smart as possible so there's less chances for it to go wrong. So trust was a key theme, from how it's going to perform to how the market's going to work, to accreditation, to how do you choose the right technology for your house. And so we came around to the view that we needed to design a best practice document that would tell people and demystify this entire process. And so one of the things we did was quite innovative, is that we didn't do it. Well, we led it, but it was all these people at the bottom were the key stakeholders in the project. So we didn't do what scientists normally do, which is we'll design it, we'll put it out to consultation, you tell us things you like or don't like, and maybe we'll change it, but that's your report, and that's our final outcome. And it might sit on a shelf, and we've all done stuff like that. But we decided to actually design it and co-produce the guidance with members of the public, with the insurance sector, with the people who made these technologies, and with the government. And that made it a pretty challenging process. But we also got enormous buy-in. They knew they were happy with it. And when it was finished, they already had it factored into their processes, that they were already recommended it in their policies, because it was part of, they had buy-in too. So it worked really well. Those are the two guidances that we came up with, available for free download if anyone is that interested on that website above, smartfloodprotection.com. And we decided a 6-step process to try and communicate what people do in these situations, because it had not really been done before. And so from assessing the risk, because each risk would demand a different approach, to planning your scheme, to installing it, to make sure that it was designed correctly, and also maintained so you didn't put a cat flap in it, because insurers aren't going to give you a discount unless they know it's going to be maintained properly. So, just to conclude, of our hazard changed over time. So flooding moved from being a technical domain to social technical, and that's not just flooding. Other risks are starting to experience that transition too. So if we think about water quality, for example, it's not something that scientists can solve alone. And the way that disciplines had captured this really disguised how risk management is the authoritative mass behind which risk-taking resides. No matter how you look at it, we're taking risks. We just have slightly better information. We have entire professions just set up to take risks on behalf of society. And because we're not sure about things, we may need a resilience approach to do things differently. And our science, our policy, our governance were all mapped onto a certain perception of the problems, and it only changed because it became apparent that they weren't solving them. And that brings us back to some of the messages at the start about interdisciplinary research and also co-producing research with the people that it's meant to influence, the people in communities, the private sector, and governments, and so on. And I just want to end with this picture. This is, there's a famous quote about standing on the shoulders of giants, and it's what academics are meant to do, is that knowledge builds incrementally, and we only, we're building on lots of hard work by people who came before us, who helped us get to where we are now. But I want to talk about it not necessarily from an academic perspective, but from a personal perspective, is that we can't do the work we do without our support systems at home. The giants whose shoulders we stand upon put up with us going to the British Library because we need to find something about Mark Twain, which doesn't make sense in the weekend. And so, the shoulders of the giants we stand upon are our families, and everyone here who is supporting us, whatever, we all know academics, and we all have our idiosyncrasies. And so, thank you, everybody, for supporting me on this journey, and thank you for coming tonight. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iain. We were joking outside before about finishing on time. It's 7:15. No, no, it's only yeah. Iain, so you can have a pint. But look, I just want to thank you for a very engaging, relevant inaugural lecture. And the way you brought together, I think, key issues around science, technology and society that we still don't know what we don't know, but you better not quote that. I think one of the things is the whole area of uncertainty, and as a university, as we develop more knowledge, I think we don't have answers for everything. And taking an interdisciplinary approach, which we're trying to encourage, really means we can begin to push boundaries, and you've given an example of that tonight. And the way in which I think co-production of knowledge and the way we're trying to move as a university to work with end users, the way we're trying to learn across disciplines, you've really shown ways in which that can be beneficial to society. So, Iain, thank you very much, and I really appreciate the contributions that you're making to the university, and staying out for 24 hours the other night to put in a Centre of Research Excellence bid. So thank you very much, and the contributions you're making. Thank you.
The University of Waikato, where the world is going.